So, I think this is a kind of a great segue. I felt like Brent did such an amazing job. I'm like, and done. But Deb kind of brought us into talking a lot about the research and prevention. And then Brent did a really great job talking about intervention and safety. And so, what I'm really doing here is pulling out one really specific skill. And for me, though it seems like it's such a small one, I think Brent was right in saying, like, wow, like listening, that is a huge thing and such an important thing for us to talk about. And because, I have a doctorate, it's kind of in listening, like in clinical psychology, it just seemed like a really great time to talk about how you do that, really get into it and talk about the application of it. I do want this to be educational, but also like interactive. If you have questions, please feel free to drop those into the chat. There's absolutely going to be time for you to ask questions at the end. We're also going to be watching two specific videos. So the first one's going to be an example of not so great and some kind of decent listening skills. And we're going to be doing a worksheet on that. And the other one's just talking about that decision tree. Brent covered a little bit of that when he was talking about the like different levels of intervention. And we're just going to talk about some of the language that can happen around that. Our objectives basically is to learn some really great listening skills. We're going to be discussing the role of body language, paralinguistics. So it's not always exactly what you say, which is very important. And it's also how you say that thing. We're going to be talking about how you can use reflection appropriately, a little bit of a review for listen, ask, tell, and then again, doing that breakout discussion. And one of that is going to be done in a breakout room, and the other one's going to be done in a group together. Let's go ahead and jump into it. I actually really love this Turkish proverb. And if you've been to any of the trainings that I do, I always have a quote hidden somewhere in there. I love them. But this one is, if speaking is silver, then listening is gold. I think that's absolutely what we're learning to be able. Let's talk about what listening skills kind of look like. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is facing the speaker. Now, the first part of this is me saying this is very individualized. It's very about someone's history, their culture. So while we can make a lot of generalizations about what's effective, it's really important to remember that depends upon each person's specific experience. And I'm going to give you examples of that when we talk about eye contact and when we talk about personal space. But typically, generally speaking, facing the speaker is considered to be very respectful, and it shows that you're really engaged. I think some of our best communicators are actually our little ones, our keiki, because they're really great at saying, you're not listening. And you could be just sitting there like, I am. But if you're like, what is happening? They're going to be the first person to say, no, you're not listening. You're not looking at me. And that just really kind of grounds us back into knowing how important it is to be fully present with someone when they're talking, to minimize as many distractions as possible, and to really have that good facial expression and making that good eye to eye contact. Now, when we talk about eye to eye contact, know your listener if possible. If you know the person a little bit and have some context for their cultural background, it could be crucial to know whether or not eye contact is considered to be respectful or disrespectful. So for some of our indigenous communities, there are some specifically on the mainland, it would be considered actually really disrespectful to make strong eye contact with an elder in that community. There's a level of deference that actually shows respect by not making the eye contact. So again, whenever possible, if you know a little bit about someone and you're not really familiar with their cultural background, get a little bit more information, gain a little bit more competency by learning about that. Appear confident but relaxed. So I think when we're in stressful situations, that's an easy thing to say, but a really hard thing to do. The reason I say that is because if you're with someone and you're worried about their safety, you might not be feeling confident at all. And that's okay. This is me telling you that's absolutely happened to me, and that's okay. We just want you to appear confident, because if you appear confident, then they're going to feel like you're someone who can hear what they have to say and can actually support them. But if you're also fidgeting and like, I'm not I like, and you just look like you're really uncomfortable, they're going to pick that up and they're going to start to feel really uncomfortable. It's going to be more difficult for them to share. We have a metaphor where we call this the duck on the water. So above the surface of the water, The duck is calm, not moving underneath the surface, paddling frantically with their feet. And that's what we're trying to do, is to keep those feet below the visual field, even if that's how you feel, because you're going to get that support from your coworkers, your family members, other people in the community who are going to come together to support you after you've supported that person who was feeling unsafe. And the big part here is to suspend judgment. We all have our own experiences, our own values, morals, and ethics that we bring to every interaction and every situation. I have a friend who always says, yeah, sometimes I could be a petty Patty. And I just gotta laugh at that. Sometimes he's like, I'm being Petty LaBelle today. And I giggle about that. But the reality is, some days we have a hard time not having feelings of judgment. If we're having a hard time, if we're feeling really tired, like Brent said, if we're feeling stressed at work, like we are human too. And so that's why self-care is so important, that you can provide a safe space for yourself so that if you interact with someone who's also feeling like they are not in a great space, that you can still suspend your judgment. And when I say that, it's really important for me to tell you, it doesn't mean that you agree, right? There are going to be things that people talk to you about that you're like, this does not align with my morals and values. I don't even agree with this behavior or these opinions. But if I'm judgmental of that, they're not going to keep sharing their story with me. And if that's the most important thing into seeing whether or not they're actually having suicidal thoughts, then I need to practice on being curious and suspending that judgment. Being distraction free. While these are just the most amazing tech tools that we have, are mini computers, and it is very different how we use them from generation to generation. I am considered to be a gap generation in which I grew up and there was no tech. It was very, very little of it. I mean, like, flat screen TVs were not a thing. We had those giant bulky ones. I remember, like, if your phone lit up and was transparent, that was fancy. That was fancy back in the day. And then we have these newer generations of children who get tech, who get tablets and iPads, those kinds of things very, very young. And their culture around technology is vastly different than ours. And just beginning to understand, yes, we don't understand what that's like, and that's okay. We don't have to. We just have to be aware of the fact it is very different for them than it was, for example, like myself, who saw that technology rise and come in and had that difference of how I grew up versus how it is now, versus just being born into it and it was there. And they do tend to have, the younger generations, that tech with them more. They have it, and it feels like a connected part of them. They get very upset if they lose it or don't have it on them at any given time. But that can also be a fantastic tool. So when we talk about safety planning, you want to make sure that they have those numbers saved in those phones, because they have those phones on them quite a bit. And that's a really good thing for safety, including there's some apps that are really great that can contact other people. They save into them when they're feeling unsafe. They just put I'm unsafe, connects to those people they have pre-saved in there. So tech can also be your friend when you're working with someone who might struggle with these kinds of thoughts. But for us as listeners, be distraction free. Make sure that your phone's off, that your alarms are silent when you're interacting with someone. Even something as small as your phone does go off and you're like checking it can be a distraction and actually break that connection that you had, because to them it starts to feel like maybe I'm just taking up their time. And we don't want them to feel that way. So before you get really deep into conversation, you can be transparent and say, let me make sure my phone is off. I want to be really present with you and not miss any of this. So I just want to make sure it doesn't interrupt us, and then flip it over so that you don't get distracted by the light, because that can still happen, right? So just really working on being distraction free. So we mentioned suspending judgment. And again, that first question for yourself is whether or not you're even in the right state of mind. Are you feeling under the weather and sick? Are you tired? Have you been stressed at work? You need to do your own check-in to make sure that you're the best listener for this person. You can even ask that person that you're talking to, like, am I your best person to hear this? If there's someone else you'd feel more comfortable with, we can reach out and find them. That's you just being really authentic to know that, like, I don't know that I'm in the best place, or I don't know if I'm the best person for you. Be genuine, be, again, transparent and authentic. Be empathic, be able to connect with them. And even if you don't have that same experience as them, you still want to be able to say, if that had happened to me, I think I would feel a similar way. Or that sounds like it would be really, really hard. That would make me feel anxious too, just to sit in their shoes with them. Do some things that let them know that you're verbally listening. Like you can just say, yes, uh-huh. What was that you just said? Like just ask them a couple like exploratory questions. And it shows that you're tracking the narrative, that you're really tracking what they're saying to you instead of just kind of, I have a tendency to nod my head. I think that's from years of doing therapy. And I would have to be like, don't bobblehead, don't bobblehead. Like that's my like in my head, silent mantra, stop bobbleheading. And then I'd do the okay. And I'm like, no, now you look weird. So like just know that therapists and psychologists that they have their own inner dialogue going, look, look normal. The more you think about listening skills, the weirder it can become for you and trying to really show them, which is why I always say be genuine. If you don't automatically do those things, don't add them in because you think it makes you look a good listener, because it just starts to feel awkward. Use your body language to show that you're listening. Yes, nodding your head, smiling along. I would caution on the smiling. And so we were taught this little trick in psychology where you don't do a full smile, you do a half smile. Because a half smile has a lot less inference. A full smile could mean that you agree with it, that you're happy with it, whereas a half smile just means you're tracking. It just has a lot less inference, and it just shows a lot less like towards the positive. And it just doesn't mean that you're in agreement with something someone's saying. If they're telling you a story about like, and then so and so said this, and you're like, mm-hmm, you can see why you don't want a full smile. You want more of a mm-hmm, because then that shows I'm tracking, I'm listening, and has a lot less meaning to it. We talked about this just a little while ago in the fact that we were saying, be aware of the cultural differences, because what some people could be considering to be judgmental in one, other people might not consider to be in the other. That's not always easy to do because people can come from the same place and still have very unique differences between the two. For example, I tend to be very stoic in how I respond to people. I appear to be extraordinarily extroverted and bubbly, but a lot of times when I'm in my downtime, I'm actually quite like stoic and reserved. And that is very different than other people within my community that share very similar ethnic backgrounds as myself. So we all still have differences, and you're allowed to ask and just check in to say, like, you know, if you notice someone kind of responding in a way that you're like, what's happening here? You can actually just ask that, like, I noticed that you like pulled back, or you're getting quieter, or you're not sharing as much as you were. Is there something that I'm doing that's making you feel uncomfortable? Because I really don't want that to be what's happening. Like I can adjust. And you'd be surprised at the really small nuanced things that they'll pick up and say, well, when I said this, you started shaking your leg. And so I thought like you might not agree with what I was feeling. And I'm like, that's just me being fidgety. I'm gonna work on that. Let me get my stress ball. Right? It's okay to like have them join in, and you join them in that process. Nonverbals, this is I think what's so fascinating about being a good listener is that sometimes we think being a good listener is just about being able to kind of hear what people say and parrot it back, but also being a good listener, 70 to 80% of what people are picking up has very little to do with the words that you're choosing. I know that seems really high, but the reality is some things that we say, by just subtly changing how we say it, absolutely changes the meaning of it. So if I say to you, I like your shirt, she likes my shirt. Or if I say, I like your shirt, you're like, I don't think she likes my shirt. Or I say, I like your shirt. You're like, is this your shirt? Right? Exact same word selection, but you're talking about intonation. You're talking about how they drop it at the end, the rate at which they speak it. And so be very careful about how you say things, not just what you say. Be careful when you're repeating the message. So, for example, make sure that you're nodding yes while you're saying yes, because I have seen people be like, oh, yeah, I can't believe blah, blah, blah. And they're like, but you're nodding no. They didn't even notice it. Um, so make sure your nonverbals match your verbals. Of course, that next one is make sure you're not contradicting it. So making sure, for example, that you're not saying like, that's fascinating, but you're saying it like this. That's fascinating. Yeah. Right. Because it does not have that continuity of message to it. Make sure that, when you're doing your nonverbals, that you also include some substituting for a verbal message. So not always saying like, right, right. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because after a certain point, it just starts to feel rote. Like, are they listening to me? I'm not really sure. That you mix it up, that you can be like, absolutely. Hmm. That really subtle play of emotion, just allowing that to come through while you listen and interchange it with actual verbal words can be really helpful. That you complement the message. So, for example, if you're complimenting someone like, oh, I really like your shirt, just adding the smile in, adding the nod in strengthens the message and it helps get that across. Even something as simple as like, I'm listening and you lean in, really, it's a double message. It just makes that person feel more validated and supported. And then, yes, that's part of that is accenting the message. So, what I sometimes like to do is drop my volume when I'm telling you something important. I used to work inpatient psychiatric care with adolescents. And when they would get upset, they'd be like, rah, 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 get really loud. And I'd say, your homework tonight is to think about this one phrase. They'd be like, okay, great. Like, we don't have to write or journal anything. This is my favorite homework ever. I'd say, okay, your homework tonight is to think about that the loudest yell that you can have is a whisper. Let's talk about it tomorrow. They would come back in and say, Miss, I don't know what you're trying to say. That's okay. It's okay. But I'm going to show you the power of a whisper versus a yell. And I would say, get loud at me and tell me you're mad. I'm mad at you. And I'd say, okay, now whisper it to me. I'm mad at you. You see the difference? If I yell at you, it makes you get defensive and you're not hearing what I'm saying. You're like, oh, you mad at me? I'm mad at you. This is what I'm going to say when you're done yelling. But if I drop it, slow it down, and get soft, I'm mad at you. People lean in like, what did she say? And then they're like, oh. So that they actually were really good at the skill. And they started playing this game called Can We Get Dr. G? And I'd be walking through the unit and I'd hear, ducks love Doritos. And I'm like, what? And they're like, haha, I got you, right? Because the whisper makes you stop and go, wait, what did you say? And that's the thing. That's what we really want to do is to use our voice, use our body in such a powerful way that we not only create a safe space for people who need it, but we also start to model and control the space if it is unsafe. And that's what some of these things can do. It can empower you to be able to create those things. Facial expressions. I am guilty. let's just start there. I am guilty of a lot of facial expressions. Here's what we know that there's about 6 universal facial expressions across most cultures that we have. Of course, nuanced differences about what they look like, but generally speaking, they've done studies where they've shown babies pictures and they're like, okay, they respond in kind no matter what culture they've come from. And so this is what they've determined to be those universal emotions. Things like happiness, sadness, anger, surprise, fear, and disgust. If you are a very expressive person and it shows on your face, which some of us are, that's just what it is, I want you to practice controlling that a little bit. My teacher said, oh, you've got an expressive face. And I was like, yeah. And she's like, no. Like, you don't want that as a therapist. No, because they're going to see everything here. And she said, what I want you to imagine is like a theatrical mask, a Japanese no face, because that expression is neither positive nor negative. It's just very flat, very neutral. And the reason historically that they use those masks is that people would project their own emotion onto those masks. And that's your job to do. Your job is to create a neutral expression because it allows people to share their story and their feelings without like checking in on yours. And so if you're a little bit more expressive in how you control your face, just practice on doing that. And it really looks a little bit like this. Non-committal. Neither happy nor angry. It's just neutral. And that's going to help you also control that feeling of like anxiety when it comes up and have that duck on the water projection back out, which is what we want. And of course, we mentioned this before that eye contact can absolutely be a cultural aspect. I was reading the chat. So now we're going to talk a little bit about body language. Because at this point, let's say we're being really good listeners. I've got my verbals down. I'm working on my facial expressions and how I say, what I say. Now let's talk about how you're going to use your body to also convey a message. The first thing to be aware of is if you want someone to feel calm enough to tell you a difficult story, you have to model that calmness yourself. Even if you're not feeling it, try to get in a comfortable position. Try not to fidget or do other like anxiety tells. I have a friend who's like a nail biter. They have to really focus when they're talking to someone else not to nail bite because other people immediately know what that means. They're like, oh, they're uncomfortable. Oh, they're anxious. Oh, they're fidgeting. So maybe they're bored with what I'm saying, or they would rather be hearing something else, or they're agitated. You try to be as calm as possible because we don't know people's history. And so, for example, if someone came from a violent upbringing, if someone were to get fidgety while they're telling a difficult story, they actually could interpret that as like a dangerous situation. So we try to model calmness as much as possible, and we try to model what we call open posture. If you cross your arms, most people will read that as being defensive, like you're closing off, you're being secretive, and it's something that your brain interprets very quickly, even if that's not what you want the message to be. So open posture is making sure that your arms are open, not crossed, that all this space is like available, and that your hands are somewhere down to your side and not crossed over you. Because again, it's symbolic. It's very rooted in how we interpret things. If we see a crossing of things, we just interpret that to be not open. It's interesting. The half smile, we talked about that again, non-committal, but actually makes you feel like, okay, they're listening. This is one that I think is a little bit more challenging because there's some cultural components to this. I come from a community that's very physical, like they're talking to you and patting you on the back, or talking to you and like rubbing you on the shoulder, like they see you and they immediately wrap you up. But if you don't know this person well, or this person's really distressed, touch may not be a good idea. And for me, I always defer to the point of like no touch to people I don't know. And then I don't touch when people are distressed. Sometimes people just ask me, like, can I have a hug? And I say, okay. But I always defer to non-physical touch because I don't know people's background. However, I do know the statistics. I know that there's a large portion of people who have survived complex trauma, whether from childhood or whether from adulthood, or could be currently in a domestic violence situation. I'm not trying to trigger them in any way, form, or fashion. I try not to walk behind people. If I have to get somewhere, I try not to block doors, make sure that they can leave if they feel uncomfortable, and not to restrict any of their movements. If they're like, I just need to get up and walk, I'm like, that's fine. No, get up and walk if you need to do it. Just make sure that like you're safe and I'm safe. Again, there's that duck on the water metaphor of staying calm, even if you don't feel calm. Making sure that your movements are subtle. If you move too quickly or too fast towards someone, they absolutely could also get triggered by that. People who are still experiencing like post-traumatic stress disorder or have recently been through a trauma, their nervous systems are actually pretty active. And what that means is they happen to startle quickly. If you walk behind them, you move towards them too quickly, or your voice gets too loud too suddenly, they will respond in kind and not necessarily mean to. They just don't feel safe. So try at all possible to make your movement subtle. I tend to be actually a pretty loud, boisterous person sometimes, but when I'm in session, This is what I actually sound like. Okay, let's talk about what's been happening. I'm going to slow my voice down and I'm going to drop it at the end. I'm going to make sure that what I model is calming and relaxing and they don't feel unsafe. Even if that's not my personality, that is a part of me that I have honed in on that I know makes people more comfortable if they're feeling agitated. Also, again, cultural pieces and know that certain gestures are not appropriate with certain communities. And if you see someone respond like very strongly, just ask them and be like, oh my, did I do something? What just happened there? I noticed that you pulled back, and then they'll let you know. I think when you see something, say something, they will oftentimes, if you're just like innocently, like, I'm not meaning to startle you, I'm not meaning to like offend you. I noticed something happened. Can you let me know so I don't do that again? People are very open to, well, you did this and that made me feel uncomfortable. And then you can make those adjustments. This is one of those big skills, right? Don't interrupt. Being a good listener means you're not the talker. Like, I know some of us love to talk, guilty, but when someone's telling you their story, it is not appropriate to then tell them yours. Why? Because now you've shifted the focus from what they're saying to what you're saying. Sometimes, all good intentions, someone's telling you a story and you feel like, me too, that happened to me too. I want you to feel connected to me. And I want you to feel like I too have been through that. But that's not always appropriate, especially when you notice the time. If they share their story for 5 minutes and you're like, me too, and you've been talking for 15, you're losing them. They're not going to be as open to sharing with you because it's not about them anymore. It's about you. So be careful not to interrupt. Be careful being comfortable with silence. And I think that we go, yeah, I'm comfortable with silence. When you're not here, before you go into your next sessions tomorrow, have someone that you feel safe with, ask them a question and have them not answer you for 2 minutes. Time it. And I promise you, it will be the longest 2 minutes you've ever sat through. Don't make faces at them. Don't be like, ask them something simple like, what's your favorite color? And then wait. Don't repeat the question. Don't engage them with your face. Don't try to like, ha, 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 like giggle. And so they'll like interact with you. Just sit there. Because oftentimes when we ask these really difficult questions, they don't say anything. It's silence because you might be the first person that ever asked them that question. You might be the first person they've ever decided to tell that answer to, or it just could be a really difficult time and they could be upset or crying and you need to let them sit there with it. And that's fine. Helping them feel better immediately when they're trying to open up to you isn't always the answer because it's like you're trying to pack back in what they're trying to unpack. And if I really want to answer about people being unsafe, I need to let them unpack it enough to know whether or not they've told me the truth. So let them unpack it a little bit, not 100%. If you're not a mental health professional, we do not let them unpack all of it. So hear what I just said. If you are not a mental health professional, do not let them unpack all of it. If you're not a professional, don't walk someone through their complex trauma history. Your job is to say, I'm here to help you find who you need to talk to start to heal. That's what you say. And even if they want to tell you that story, say, I feel so honored that you're willing to share that with me, but I can't be that person because I think you need someone who's a fantastic listener and actually knows about this more than I do. Be really authentic at that point about your competency and who's a better fit. But I'm here to make sure you're safe. And so my job is to figure out what you need next. That's your role. Yes, embrace that silence. Practice that 2 minutes and see how comfortable you get. Now, generally speaking, I have sat, I think the longest 15, 20 minutes is the longest I've probably sat in silence. But I was the one sitting in the silence. The other person was very upset and distraught and crying. And I wasn't going to keep repeating the question while they were having that moment. I just let them have the moment. And then when they started to like calm back down, then I said, let's talk about what just happened. Just that simple. I just need to make sure that you're safe. Can we talk about that? Oftentimes we hear that when we like reflect, that that's a really powerful thing to use. And I do agree that it is, but make sure you don't jump the reflection. What I mean by that is if someone says, I'm really having a hard time at work, it's been a really difficult week, that I don't go, oh, so it's been terrible at work. I jumped the reflection, I increased it and then repeated it back. So then they'll go, yeah, I guess, yeah, I guess it's terrible. I want to stay with their exact word selection and not amplify it at all. Stay as close to it as you can. That's the restate. And then clarify if you're like, I missed a part of that. Were you saying that you're feeling overwhelmed at home or overwhelmed at work? And let them kind of give you that extra information. Make sure, because sometimes, let's be honest, sometimes you get a big spiel of something and you're like, they've been talking for 20 minutes. I can't keep all of this up. I can't remember it all. I have a terrible memory, which is ironic because of what I do for a living. However, what I can track is how people feel. If you tell me a long story about being stressed at work, being stressed at home, you're having issues in your relationships, and there's 45 minutes of that, I can track and say, wow, so you're feeling really anxious in a lot of different places in your life. They still feel validated and heard and supported because you got the actual general theme. I tell them, I'm not going to remember that it was Becky's fourth birthday and Aunt Susan forgot to bring her that one present. Like, that's really hard for me, but I can remember, like, you were sad because you knew that your daughter was disappointed. I can remember the emotional content. And so that's what we focus on. Follow the feeling, and that will help you remember the content. And you're going to use their exact words. So if they use a very interesting word, so if someone says, I just feel hollow, like that to me immediately, I'm like, whoa, that's a really unique word to use in that moment. I'm going to hold that word and go, wow, hollow. What is that like? Like, what does hollow mean? Because that's just such a unique word to use. And that will help you keep close to how they're feeling. And then always respond with empathy. Always respond with, like, it sounds like you feel really sad. Like, that is a really hard time. Again, I don't have to agree. I just have to be able to see that they're having a human experience. The experience is hard. That's it. You noticed me doing this earlier when we were talking about working with the adolescents and using your voice. You want to calm a situation down, drop your sentence at the end. If you're listening to spa tapes, relaxation tapes, you'll notice they drop at the end. For some reason, it's relaxing. I don't get it, but that's what your brain does. If I want you to be really excited, I'll go up at the end because everything exciting goes up. Yes, the brain is a very interesting organ. And so use your voice to control the situation. If someone's like really low energy, if someone's really anxious, I feel like it's a little bit easier to use it when someone's anxious to calm them down than to insert energy when someone's like depressed, because that can be actually very off-putting. If you're perky and they're sad, like, not a good mix. But what you can do instead is talk a little bit quicker, not too fast, but just add a little bit more speed, because then they're going to have to track it and they're going to be like, okay, it will just add just a little bit of energy in. But if they can't, that's okay. Just slow it back down again. Listening, this is probably my personal one. Listening doesn't mean solving. If someone you know calls you and they're like, I'm having a problem, you can have them, you can just straight ask them and say, do you need someone to vent to? Just to listen to what's happening? Or do you need me to come up with like a solution with you? If they're like, no, I just need you to listen. You're like, oh my goodness. You let me off the hook. I don't have to come up with any answers. I just have to listen to you. Thank you so much. So yeah, just ask that person, like, do you want advice or do you just want to talk? Because that just relieves me of any responsibility of coming up with a brilliant answer if you don't need that. And I don't want to offer to fix something that you don't need fixed, because that might actually feel unempowering to you, disempowering. Again, asking questions close to the narrative, focusing on that, and then offering very limited amounts of your own experience. If you're going to offer something to them, make sure it's a little bit less specific. So if someone's having a really hard time, you can say, I know we all have hard times. I've been through them too. Still validating, still sharing a little bit, but not pulling the focus away from the other person. Let's talk about personal space because I actually think this is kind of a unique one. We don't talk about it enough. We often say, now with us being more conscious of personal space and we're like 6 feet. But outside of that, before we had those kind of thoughts, typically what you would see, especially in the US, is like a 1.5 to 3 foot radius. However, I work with people, for example, who were recently released from an incarceration, and they needed like 6 to 8 feet. And I noticed when I was working with someone, they were very uncomfortable. And I said, like, are you okay? And they're like, no, because when people are very close to you and you're like in prison, that means there's about to be a fight. The closer you get, the more unsafe you become, because that means there's about to be something that happens. Like that's how it begins. And so I would say, like, is this office big enough? Number one, they'd say, no, it's too small. Okay, we're going to move offices. Then I would say, am I far enough away from you that you feel safe? And they might say yes or no. And if no, I'm like, I'm going to keep moving as far enough away from you that you do feel safe, because then you're not going to talk to me if you're already having your nervous system kind of amplified. Now, that's a really specific example, but I've also had people who have, for example, been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder for any number of reasons, who've been through any type of really intense, complex trauma, who just are less comfortable with you being in their personal space or reaching out towards them or leaning in towards them. And that's just something you have to be aware of. That's why we don't touch anyone. And that's also why we try to keep our hands visible as much as possible, whether they're resting in your lap or resting on the hand rests, because we don't want people wondering like what we're rummaging around for. And if I do have to rummage for something, I'll literally say, okay, I'm gonna grab my pen real quick because I want to make sure I write this down so they know exactly what I'm doing. It's just being very transparent in what's happening. You can create your safe space by, again, remaining calm, validating how people feel, making sure there's a private space, but both of you have access to the door and you're not blocking anything. You also want to make sure that, let's say it's a work environment, you still can call someone else to back you up or come in and support you if it's somewhere where you're feeling not as competent or not as safe yourself, or you just need a little bit more support. You're like, I think June knows this person better than I do. I'm going to ask them if it's okay if she joins us. Use your skills. Don't make any promises that you can't keep. Don't tell someone I'm here for you whenever you need me if you're not actually there. If you're not 24/7 available, don't tell them that you are, because then they're going to be disappointed and they're going to feel like they weren't really truthful about that. They said they cared, but they weren't really there. Better to give them hotlines and helplines, crisis lines, so that they do have someone there who's available 24/7. And then, of course, which Brent talked about, that listen, ask, and tell. There is some safe messaging to do. And so if you're working with people and you're talking about any kind of concerns around like suicide or loss of suicide, what you're going to look at is making sure that you're reporting it as a public health issue. You're including any kind of resources they might be able to use. You're using that appropriate language. So saying things like loss by suicide, death by suicide, and not like a failed attempt or an unsuccessful, because those have really negative connotations. We always want to emphasize help and hope, because the reality is you can get hope. There can be like health and healing and moving forward. It doesn't have to be something that's a lifelong issue. They get exactly what they need. And then you can ask an expert to come in and help support. There are some warning signs, and we can briefly talk about that. It's just people being verbal and saying that they're having those thoughts, that they're looking for a way to kill themselves. They're saying, I feel hopeless, that I don't have a purpose, that they're feeling trapped, or that they're in pain. We hear this often, that they're a burden to themselves or other people. If they're using substances and there's an increased use, we know that sometimes when people act on suicidal thoughts, it's quite impulsive, and substance use actually makes it more impulsive. Also, if you're acting anxiously, agitatedly, or reckless, you start to look at those behaviors. Any change in sleep, because change in sleep is very mood related. If people are isolating or withdrawing, if you're showing anger, We're talking about wanting revenge and again, mood swings that are consistent and have lasted for a while. We want to make sure that if you have enough of these warning signs, if there's concerns, if you ask a question and they said, yes, I'm having these concerns, you're not leaving them alone. You're not leaving them in an unsafe situation that you're removing anything that they could use to harm themselves, and that you're calling those crisis numbers to get them help or helping them seek emergency services in other ways. That being said, you will get a PDF of this slideshow. So you're going to have these crisis resources. You'll see a different number of them up there, from the text line to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and even the poison helpline should you need it. If you're wanting to learn more information about us, we do have some social media here. Feel free to follow up on those if you're interested. And then this is a way to get in contact with me or with Mental Health America Hawaii. So that's the end of my slideshow, but that actually is not the end of my presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing those now. And what we're going to do is we're going to watch a short video that's going to introduce and explain what we're going to be doing on our breakout. Aloha, thank you for joining us. We're going to spend the next few minutes looking at a video. We're being joined by Jerry. Thank you so much for being a volunteer today. And you're going to have a worksheet that's in front of you. There's going to be 3 categories. And as Jerry and I had this short conversation, what I want you to do is to kind of pick out the things that you thought that I did well as a compassionate listener, the things that maybe I didn't do so well, or opportunities that I missed where you might have done something different or added it in. So for the next few minutes, just take that worksheet, put it in front of you, and identify those 3 selections, and then fill it out. And we'll talk about it when we're done. So we'll go ahead and get started. Hey, Jerry, how's it going?
Oh, it's been rough.
Yeah. What's been rough?
I don't know. I just got a lot going on, and I don't know how I'm gonna just do everything.
Yeah, sounds like you're busy.
I don't know. The house is a mess. I've got so much to do at work. It's just everything is overwhelming.
Yeah. Have you just started feeling overwhelming, or has that been a feeling you've had for a while?
Now, I really can't say when it started, but I've been feeling like this for a while now.
Yeah. Have you noticed it's gotten better or no over time?
It seems like everything it's just getting worse. Things are just piling up.
Have you been able to talk to anyone, like friends or family, about that?
Oh, that would just be one more thing to worry about.
It's hard to get support maybe from them.
I feel like I should be able to do this myself.
Oh.
I feel like I should be able to do all of this. I don't know what's wrong with me.
Is it possible that maybe your expectations for yourself are really high, and that maybe if you had a little bit of help it'd be easier? I need help a lot of the time when I'm having a hard time.
I'm just tired all the time. I don't know. I feel like I just can't get things done.
Yeah. Feeling run down.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I really wanted to talk to you was because I noticed that like you were not spending as much time kind of interacting with all of us. And I know that's something that you really enjoy doing, and you've just seemed really kind of down and sad the last few days. So I really care about you and I wanted to check in.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. I mean, if you ever want to talk, I'm absolutely here to support you and see what we can do to help each other out. I mean, I feel the same way sometimes. I get tired and have a hard time.
Well, that's nice to hear. Sometimes I feel like everybody else can do this. Everybody else is having no problems, but it's nice to hear that even you feel a little run down sometimes.
Oh yeah. I think that like we want the world to see the picture perfect of our lives, and not necessarily the behind the scenes. I think a lot of people probably feel really tired and run down right now, and just not talking about it.
Thanks, Mestisa. That really helps me feel better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tell myself every day, it's okay to not feel okay. And as if we can just kind of, I don't know, like embrace it and know that like we're just going to feel different every day and it's a challenging time. And that when I really feel alone and when I really feel sad, I just need to reach out.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, just check this really quick. Yeah, if there's anything I could ever do for you, just let me know.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Well, thanks for talking to me today.
Yeah. All right.
Of course. A big thank you to Jerry for making that video with me. She's so awesome. But we're just going to take a few minutes to kind of go into our breakouts and have a little bit of a robust discussion about what you thought was effective, what was not effective, and what kind of opportunities I missed. Like, oh, she could have gone down there and done that thing, and that could have been maybe more productive. So we're going to go ahead and move into those breakout rooms, and then we're going to come back and aloha. Thank you for joining me today, and we're going to be talking about safety for just a few minutes. I wanted to go ahead and walk you through the process of doing a suicide assessment in a very conversational way. They're very long, detailed suicide assessments that are typically done by a mental health professional. But if you are having concerns about someone that you know or care about in terms of safety, it's okay to go ahead and ask them the question. If you're seeing warning signs, if they're expressing suicidal thoughts, please ask the question and know that when you ask it, you don't put that into their mind. Research has shown that just by asking the question actually shows that you are a supportive person that they can go to. So the first step is you're seeing warning signs, so go ahead and ask that question. Are you thinking about suicide? Now, note that I didn't ask if they were thinking about harming themselves. I've worked with many people who have had concerns with suicide, and they informed me, and it's bared out in the research that sometimes when you ask someone if they're thinking about harming themselves, they will still say no, even if they're having suicidal thoughts. So we want to be very clear when we ask that question. Are you thinking about suicide? If someone says yes, then we go ahead and ask them the next question, which is, are you creating a plan? Are you collecting the means to which you'll act on this plan? Now, if the person had said no, we still want to connect them to professional support because there were warning signs. And those warning signs means they need a little bit more support. If they said yes, again, we're asking the question, are you making a plan? Are you collecting the means to how you will act on your thoughts? If they say, no, I'm not creating a plan, but I do have the thoughts, again, connecting them to professional resources and making sure that they have crisis resources saved on their phone and on their person should they need them. If they say, yes, I am creating a plan, your next question is to figure out how immediate that plan is. So you're going to ask them, when are you planning to act on your plan? When are you going to enact the plan? If they tell you it's not going to be for a few months or a few years, it doesn't mean that we don't go ahead and connect them to professional support. Because what we know is that suicide can be a very impulsive act and things could change and shift very quickly. If they tell you that they have a plan and that they're going to act on it soon, we do not leave them by themselves and we go ahead and connect them to emergency services so that they can be assessed by a professional and get the support that they need. This could be a very challenging thing to do with someone who is resistant to help. But the number one priority in everything that we do is safety. And I always say, I'd rather someone be upset with me and be here tomorrow than for me to not do what I need to do to make sure they're safe and them not be. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes with us learning the importance of asking the question, learning about the different steps and to get the help that they need. And you're going to hear later on about the different resources that are available to you and to the people you care about that you can save on your phone or to your devices or just have on yourself so that when someone else is in need, you can share it. Every person that informs themselves could be a life saved. Thank you so much. So that was a very short video on kind of the decision tree aspect, highlighting the importance of asking the question figuring out if they are starting to create that plan and if they're going to act on that plan. And each step kind of definitely is going to need those professional supports, no matter what the answer is, and then tells you when to kind of act on it. There's a lot of individual differences, and there's no cookie cutter kind of precision way to apply that to every single situation. I wish that there was. I am very well versed in it, and every situation has been just a little bit different from each other, but that's okay. As long as we have that general template, it can help support us as we start to move through. I know that there was a lot of information that we covered today. But I think, going into the research, looking at the importance of prevention, how we do intervention, and also how we educate ourselves to make sure that other people are safe and how to be good listeners was covered really well today. It gives us a really nice umbrella as we move into tomorrow and some of the things that we'll be talking about then. We do have